Miguel Iturrate back here on the CRP, and I'm going to fly solo today, but we're going to do Cage Rage podcast number 76, and boxing history is going to be the subject. One of my favorite subjects. We've been letting it go by the wayside. We've been putting some resources into news and some other stuff, getting other parts of the site up to speed, so you know, we haven't done as many boxing history podcasts, and I wanted to get one in here, especially based on everything going on in the heavyweight division. We did a quick podcast on the state of the heavyweight division and what's going on with Deontay Wilder, Tyson Fury, and Anthony Joshua. Here, the situation, as I see it, is, you know, you've got Joshua and Eddie Hearn signing in with DAZN. They may also be able to work with ESPN with some of their other, you know, Eddie Hearn will. I don't know if, you know, Joshua is going to be able to. So, you know, Joshua's got Gerald Miller as his next opponent. That fight goes down here on June 1st. So it's something that, you know, we'll see exactly how many people see it on DAZN and see what's going on. That's kind of the basis for the history lesson here. And we are at a crossroads with the distribution of boxing here. Obviously, the streaming services are, you know, becoming pervasive. They're getting a lot of material, especially on the boxing side. In the MMA world, you know, you've got the UFC that floats above everybody else. The UFC kind of still has their own things going with ESPN, and they signed up with ESPN as well. And, you know, that leaves like DAZN with, like, you know, B-class MMA stuff. However, their boxing side looks pretty good on paper. We'll see, you know, 2 years down the line if they're able to deliver on all that. But that's what makes it interesting right now. Because here's the deal: their first big contract, the first contract we got out of DAZN was the record-breaking Canelo Alvarez contract with for like $360 million, and you know, that's a big chunk of money, and it reminds me of the old days. And I'm going to have our editor here, Aaron Kane, Killer Kane, put up the picture of the Fight Pictures book by Dan Striebel that I'm looking at. This is really an eye-opening book for me, and you know, if it goes beyond boxing for people, you know, film fans would benefit from reading this book, because it speaks so much of the history of early film. And the bottom line is that early film was tied in to the boxers of the time. They actually used boxers to test film, and from there will come the history lesson of podcast number 76. So, hang in there. We got Fight Pictures as a basis for the conversation. Terrific book here by Dan Striebel, because one of the things that it reveals there is that the big boxing match of the early days, the first guys who actually were able to cash in and you know, make a mint out of what they were doing, and that is filming the fights. Because up until then, you know, here's the deal: there's no film, right? So boxing was a live sport. You know, in the 1880s, 1890s, people, you had to go and see boxing. You couldn't see it, you know, on film or anything like that. There was no way. It just was out of the question. There was also no way to, you know, sit at home and listen to it on the radio and stuff. You had to go. That was the boxing allure. There becomes, you know, you get the whole trip. You know, you've got the Industrial Revolution happening. So in cities, you've got a middle class starting to burgeon. You know, men with a little spending money. You've still got some adventurous guys heading out west to make their fortunes mining and stuff like that. The trains are making things smaller. You've got telegraph. You've got, you know, the newspapers, and information is starting to get around. But in the 1880s, you had to go to the, you know, to the fight, and a lot of the times that happened. You know, Wednesday nights at the 5 Points were set aside for, you know, fighting. You know, since this is a history podcast and we've never shied away from the racial stuff, you know, you got to be honest with you, you know, it probably was something along the lines of, you know, Wednesday was fighting and, you know, Thursday black fighters. And there must have been some segregation there, and at some point, you know, mixing or whatever happened. Um, so anyway, and all of a sudden, rich guys start and scientists start to hear about this technology because we could take pictures in the 1880s. You start to get pictures and stuff, and we've got documented pictures of Bob Fitzsimmons and many of the fighters of that era that are well documented. We know a lot about Fitzsimmons' physique, how long his arms were. You could see the muscular development on his back in certain pictures where they were trying to emphasize it. And they would take pictures for that. It would be like, wow, look at his back. Take a picture of it, because it isn't like today where everybody's got a picture and you're just snapping away. So, it was a big deal. So now all of a sudden they've got the technology for pictures that they're putting together a picture, and they can string together 10 or 15 seconds worth of video. And now all of a sudden you've got video. What's good on video? You've got the early video stuff is, a guy standing there against a wall. Maybe he's juggling or, moving his feet or, dancing or doing something. Maybe there's a dog. They're trying to capture motion. And somewhere along the line, the boxers and the motion of boxing becomes something that's useful. So, the book reveals that, of the first 100 hours or several hundred hours of film, about 50% of it is guys simulating boxing. Not real boxing, but at least known boxers doing a simulation for the cameras and things like that. That's what we're going to get into, the real interesting stuff here. Because, so DAZN gives out this big contract to Canelo, and DAZN is really the first of the big streaming services. But then what happened really fast on DAZN came in ESPN. ESPN came in with Bob Arum. They appear to have lured away some of the other fighters that that DAZN was interested in, and that makes it very interesting because I could see Tyson Fury sitting there and looking at the American market and being like, "Wow, what do we do?" And you got Eddie Hearn there, who's not a friend of Tyson Fury's, right? And Eddie Hearn's on DAZN, and you might have reasons to not be, who do you trust? And all of a sudden, Bob Arum, who's been around for 100 years, and ESPN, if you look up DAZN 5 years ago, they weren't doing much. And ESPN is an institution, so if you've got the ESPN name attached to a $100 million contract, I feel a lot better about that than I would, about DAZN at this point. With all due respect, DAZN still hasn't delivered a lot of what they're promising. They're gearing up. They're going to do it. They're going to try. And we'll see how it goes. But, that's how that all goes. So, anyway, so we have, back in the old days, we've got big bad Bob Fitzsimmons. And Bob here, is, to me, one of those guys that, goes down in history as... just a historic figure. And here, in his fight with James Corbett, that went down in March of 1897. This was the fight for the world heavyweight title that got filmed, and everybody saw it. And now somewhere in the middle of the 1890s, there starts to be, now what's boxing? In England, I guess before this, and they may have had film technologies going on in England and Paris and a couple other spots as well, right? But in England, they had the unique thing of the booths. So, you had boxing coming from the booths kind of into like the sporting clubs. But in the 1880s, you had guys that traveled the countryside with a little booth and be like, hey, gather an audience. We're going to do some boxing as an exhibition. And then, maybe even take fights from the audience and stuff. Must have been just a unique human, encounter. Just every one of those must have been an unbelievable scene. And you can see why boxing survived, because those types of stories are going to be imprinted in your head. But somewhere in the in the 1890s, film starts to come up. So now what happens now? They start to be able to deliver film in theaters. And now theaters start to open in New York and in the cities and stuff. In the theater, you got basically the machine that's going to play the film. You're going to get delivered a big, film copy, basically, of the film that was taken, that's been edited and stuff like that, you'd get the fight 3-4 months afterwards, but you get the fight, right? And that's what was planned. A lot of the times, the crew that filmed it, and this is one of the things. So, what did it take to film it? It's not like they said, well, you know, CBS's film crew's going to grab it, you know. This was like the guys had to figure out and test and put together the cameras. And at that point, they had to be in boxes and things. And, you know, make sure there was enough lights and things. They burned fighters with the lighting that they tried to use on some of these, you know, films, especially on the indoor side, you know. So just crazy stuff going on to pull the fight off. So when they finally pull it off and they get the Fitzsimmons fight with Corbett, you know, in the theaters, it's about, you know, an hour long, the whole film or whatever, and that's the longest film ever put together at that time, right? So now they're at the cutting edge. Now everybody went to see it. Even people who weren't boxing fans went to see it. The interesting thing about the film thing is that now women could see it now, and they're great. You know, that's why the story of boxing is the story of America, and I love it. You know, prior to this, the 1880s, 1870s, I'm sure that there were women sneaking into boxing matches. If they had to be disguised as men, you know, so be it. And there was certainly, you know, a cultural thing there. But now here, your common women folk would go to the theaters and they could see boxing. They could see, you know, again, the films that were there. This is silent boxing now, you know, silent film. There's no, you know, audio that goes along with the film. No. We're not talking about any audio getting captured or anything like that. As a matter of fact, you know, you get to the theater, and this was, you know, there would be a guy with a voice, and he'd be like, "Welcome to the Bob Fitzsimmons versus Jim Corbett fight," and he'll tell you round one, and it would actually be a script and a guy standing on the stage reading it while you watch the film. You know, that's what film was in the early days. 1897, you left, you know, you decided to go with the family into town to see the new theater. And, you know, you'd never seen anything like that before. There's nothing like it. Now, all of a sudden, you're going to see a repeat of a fight that you read about in the newspapers, you know? And let me tell you, Dan Strebel does a great job. And like I said, the book is, it could also be for film fans. You don't have to be a boxing fan to appreciate the level that he went to. So now, but I'm going to tell you why the history of boxing is the history of humanity. You know, the book touches on, and there's great pictures of, you know, in the 1910s, you had a whole set of black fighters that went to Paris. And in Paris, there were theaters and things showing them. And, you know, I'm going to send him a photo of this picture. And it's film of black fighters being shown at a theater, and the absurdity of how humanity is, again, touching on racism that we always do. The photo that we're about to show shows that the theater has hired a white actor in blackface to portray a black boxer outside of the theater, like to call people in. They couldn't hire a black person to do it. They had to get a guy in blackface. So I mean, the blackface is being used in this picture from France to lure people in to see the fights on film. And again, I don't know how the fighters felt. You know, they all got rights and stuff like that, but they were all aware that Fitzsimmons made $1 million off of that fight because everybody went to see it afterwards, you know. And nobody made the $1 million in the immediate aftermath, but every fighter through 1910, 1915, until the technology changed and rules changed, they were looking to have a film crew film their fights and see if they could get distribution for their fights in the network of theaters out in the States, and that would lead to a windfall. And that was the early way to monetize the fight. So now when they get to the theater, like I said, in France, they've got the absurdity of using blackface, you know, for the black fighters. So again, once again, the change there. And Jack Johnson, you know, was one of the film's early darlings. You know, there were documentaries made about him in several languages and that sort of stuff. So definitely we're talking about an interesting situation. But now let me tell you about, so we're talking about, you know, women being able to see the fights, but you get into a little bit of the history where, women were sneaking into fights before that. They'd sneak into fights after that, too. Women wouldn't be allowed to go to fights, fully, I don't think, until like the 1920s. They're still cited in newspaper articles, in the teens in those years where, hey, this boxing match could be attended by women. They're actually advertising when it happens and things like that. So, they weren't able to. So women were sneaking in there. But what I want to point out is, now again, you had guys testing a new technology, the film, the cameras. So you had guys making up cameras. You had some technology, just like, guys my age will remember the old Beta versus VHS war, and how VHS eventually won out on the Beta system, even if, many people still considered, for the time, the Beta one was a better system. Anyway. There were different types of film. Kodak was a guy, actually the dude was there named Kodak making his camera and his stuff, There were other competitors and other methods of getting film and getting it copied and things like that. So some were tried and true. Some guys were hawking their own technology, trying to get it ahead of everybody else. And it was a free-for-all. It was an absolute free-for-all. So now, on top of filming the fight, filming the legitimate fight, which meant getting with the promoter, setting up the cameras, the lighting, doing the whole thing, having the fighters fight, and, figuring out how much money they were going to get for the film rights and things like that. And everybody, they were aware of that stuff early on, trust me. And, all that went on. So now what happens? I'm guessing that, you got New York, and the theater pops up in New York, and then, Chicago, and then, Los Angeles isn't going to be left behind on that. And then, how soon was it before, a big town in the Midwest, like a Kansas City, hey, they had their own film theaters and stuff popping up. And then Wichita Falls, a little bit smaller, but, now you're out there. Nashville, Cleveland, all these, Buffalo. You get towns where actually, there were, Milwaukee, where there were ties to fights as well, So now, all these theaters are sitting there, and they need material, and it's not like, nowadays, this is the film you had to be bought, so it's like, I filmed the fight. Now, I got to take that back and edit it, and then not only edit it, but start to make copies of it, right? So now it's like, all of a sudden, it's like you're, get the old VHS out and make 50 copies of a VHS tape, illegally to send fights to friends or whatever. Yeah, these guys had to make dupes of the original copy. They couldn't just say, hey, could you make 50 at a time, or, not like that. It wasn't that simple, right? So now all of a sudden it's like, if you could get a fight and you could get the tape of it, hey, we got orders coming in for the Fitzsimmons fight from Kansas City. We got orders coming in for the tape, from Iowa City. Hey, that's a new theater. We got cities popping up in Montana that have theaters. We got theaters out west where the mining guys, are still heading out west, looking for their, in the mountains of the deserts and stuff like that, looking for their fortune in mines and things like that. Those towns are all of a sudden they're popping up and getting theaters, entertaining the masses. And, so you got the fight tape, and then you had to make copies of it. Then the copies had to go out so that, the theaters could show it. So it was a transaction that took a couple of months. Then the theaters would show the thing, and then the tape would sit in the theater and be on the shelf, which is why we've got all that, And then at some point you got live transmission coming up in the 40s where we've just got fights that are lost, that people saw through TV and stuff, but nobody was copying them. But at least in the early days, it was so primitive that they had to make the copies and stuff. So now, picture you're the theaters, and the theaters are like, all right, we're going to order this fight. Yeah, order all the fights, So then all of a sudden they've got little stashes with the fights and things, and people would go to the theater to see fights. Women could go to the theater to see fights. So what happens? There just weren't enough fights filmed. And fighting, at the end of the day, was the most popular sport. This is another reason here. In the streaming, the Zone, ESPN, in what you saw the WWE and UFC do with their networks, the fight passes and stuff like that, they're ahead of the major sports. The NBA's got their network and NFL and stuff like that, but they are all still married to ground network TVs channels, Foxes, NBCs, and big ticket items like that. And those items, when will they roll out their streaming services? Or are they caught left behind and somebody else is going to, buy them, or they're going to buy one later, or what the situation is there. But there again, the boxing in the 1890s really didn't have competition from sports. If you read early accounts, football was getting started. Collegiate football, there were very little of what would resemble a pro team around there, although there was barnstorming and stuff. But if you read the early reports of football, and the blocking and things that went on, it was a free-for-all to the point where, like, boxers were afraid of the football players. They're like, man, those guys are crazy. You can't, because, rules came afterwards. But those were rough and rugged times. But there was no organized football. Baseball, same thing. Basketball, same thing. So you didn't have organized sports that had the Americans' attention. It was just boxing in the newspapers in terms of sport. Maybe a little bit of info on the Yankees once you got to the 1900s and stuff like that. Baseball and stuff, the Red Sox and the East Coast, by the 1900s. But in the 1880s, 1890s, boxing was everything. And then boxing was the first, seen on film. First on radio. And now really the first that's giving their services over to DAZN and to ESPN for streaming and starting to leave the network. So another little history tie in there, from the early days. So we're talking about, the fighters looking to hire crews and things like that. And, there weren't enough fights. There weren't enough crews. There wasn't enough coordination there to get every fight taped or anything like that. So a lot of fighters were like, I was going to get taped. The guys didn't show up. Or I couldn't get the crew done. Or the crew showed up and there was a screw up with the lights and it didn't work. The whole investment got lost. So, I mean, there was money lost trying to film the fights and stuff like that. But at the same time, there was one company that the book refers to very clearly where they would do fight simulations. So what they would actually do is they would hire the fighters, actual fighters. Bob Fitzsimmons did reenactments of his fights with certain fighters, like on New York rooftops and stuff like that. That's the kind of thing that these guys would do. And I mean, I'm talking about what the pictures show is very, very elaborate. Filming stuff. On the rooftop in New York, refilming a fight. It means putting a ring in. And if you look at fights from those times and that sort of stuff, a lot of it was done on bleachers. A lot of it was like, if you remember the picture I used to have behind me during the podcast too. You got the bleachers, you got the men with the hats that, everybody bought the same hat to block the sun off and stuff like that. And, all the men in suits or white shirts, and, that's how people went out. Well, some of these reenactments would have 200 people in the audience dressed like that. So that the film could be sold at times. If you could fool people, again, when we look at it now with our trained eye, with, what we know about CGI and what we've seen, just from Star Wars, not to mention, graphics and things and, little Nemos and things like that. We've had our minds blown a million times. But we're talking about people who literally came from a house where they would have a hearth and the fire gave them the warmth and the light, and they're going to a theater and they're seeing on film images of people for the first time. So many people probably bought a reenactment of a fight. Many theaters probably showed a reenactment of a fight, advertising it as the real fight. People may have gotten to see it as the real fight. People may not have been aware at this point that they were actually watching a reproduction or a fake. But in the early, imagine that we're talking about a cottage industry at this point. It's just starting. Like I stated, the boxing that is in the first 100 hours of film ever that we have, that's still preserved in the Library of Congress. boxing's at half of it. So boxing was there from the very beginning. They showed, in order to show, people would go to the theater to see the thing. Like I said, a dog walked in the room. There it is, a guy juggling, a guy running, stuff like that, because, storytelling came later, and the whole idea of the silent film and stuff like that, is an adaptation of it. But at the very first thing, it was like, hey, look what this is, check this out. And everybody's like a child looking at the screen of the phone right now, They go to a theater, buy a ticket, and watch it. And if it was boxing, it was some of the more compelling stuff that they would actually be able to watch. So people would do reenactments of it and sell it as the real thing. The fighters would take part of it. It was money coming in. Bob Fitzsimmons actually sat on a rooftop with a guy he just beat up the week before, doing a reenactment of his fight, with a producer telling him, all right, stop, how the camera's doing, all right, restart, and it would give them a chance to film the fight, and if the cameras got hot or whatever, they could wait and stuff like that. Meanwhile, you got an actual fight going on. Everything had to go perfect for the cameras, right? There was no room for error. And when you're talking about new technology, there was always going to be stuff. So it's just, it was absolutely a free-for-all to me. But the parallels to today are going to be very real that I come up with, So you had people reenacting fights. You had people selling fights as the real thing that were fake fights. You had fighters complicit in it just for the dime because they didn't really care. They actually didn't think about, the reputation. It was just, hey, we're going to film. I got your opponent here. Let's just film a reenactment of the fight. People did it. And, the fighters were always looking to cash in on this stuff. So it's like a lot of the times they felt like, oh, I had a fight and I couldn't get it filmed. And then all of a sudden this other guy with another film company, out of, some other city and state or whatever, but hey, he's got the chops and he's going to give you $5,000, to do a recreation, even if it, $500, whatever it might have been. These guys, they were prize fighters. They wanted to take the money, so they would go out and do. So you had films of fights that were not filmed, and then films of fights that were filmed, so you have the real fights and the not fights and stuff like that. But that tells you all you need to know about humanity to me. You know what I mean? If that's happening so early in the game, then what's going to happen here with the Zone and ESPN and stuff like that? Now, look, to me, the Zone's facing a tall order here, and ESPN is too, but ESPN has the ability to fall back on their tried and true brand name that's been around, their bread and butter, and that will, be around for forever at this point. If this entity doesn't work out all the way, there'll be another entity or a 2.0 version for ESPN, or they'll get bought up by, a bigger corporation, and they'll be part of something, So I feel like that part of it with ESPN versus the Zone's the new kids on the block kind of thing. And people are going to sit around and wait for them, to have a couple of years, before, like, for example, why would a fighter turn down a $100 million offer? Hey, somebody either showed you that you're going to make more money, but also there may be that trust factor where it's like, man, the Zone has I know they signed Canelo. Canelo's in, but does that mean everybody's in? We're all going to get paid, or are these guys stretching out? Do we know? What have they done in the past in the business? So they have a lot of questions to be answered. Now, they just took their subscriptions from $9.99 a month to $19.99 a month, but they can give you a package of a year for $100, and that's pretty good. At the end of the day, you get $100, you're at about $9 a month for all the boxing you could eat. Now, where's their roster going to top off? That's what's going to be interesting to me, because a lot of the time, like this past week, with all due respect, Golden Boy, who should be one of their better clients, right? Golden Boy and the Zone were fumbling around with the advertising for the Thursday night fights. I know Golden Boy used to do their fights at the Belasco Theater, and that sort of stuff. The fight night events that Golden Boy used to do. And this is the replacement for it. Thursday night fights on the Zone. is kind of what was advertised. At the end of the day, they gave it to us on Facebook and Ring TV, and the Zone's logo was on it, and they were pushing it, but I don't know that it was transmitted on the Zone. I couldn't get it. Some of the people I know with the Zone couldn't find it there. So they're still not organized at 100% level. Again, the other part of it is, look, I love boxing. I'm cool with watching, hey, 8-rounders from Italy. I'll sit around and burn a couple hours and watch a couple 8-rounders from Italy. I have no problem doing that. And the Zone, if the Zone is going to do that on a Wednesday night, Thursday night for me, I'm good with that. But on some weekends, I don't want to be left alone either. I'd like to see that consistently. I've seen that type of fighting that, Italy is one that jumps out that, they've had fights at recently, a card over there. It could happen with some of the smaller British cards too, where it's just not that appealing to the American crowd. Some of the smaller American cards aren't going to be that appealing to the British crowds and to some other crowds as well. So how are they really going to be able to deliver, boxing all the time, or, give everybody a compelling product that says, yeah, I'll just re-up every month, or I'll pay them the 100 and just not worry about it for a year, and anytime I want, there's probably going to be something on it. Is it worth $19.95 a month now to some people? So we'll see. Again, that delivering week to week to week to week, they don't have that under their belt. And here's the other thing is I talked about it with the book and the history stuff. We're talking about cheating, right? It's like, if somebody's got the Zone on their phone, can they copy it, stream it, move it to their computer, ship it, put it on a website, and have other people see it, without subscribing? I don't know, and I don't need the answer to that for myself personally, but I suspect that, that there's going to be ways to see the Zone, just like there's ways to see pay-per-views without paying, and just like I suspect that the cheaters, like the guys making fake fights in the early days, are going to be there, right? So the Zone may come out with all guns blazing, and they may say, we need 1 million new subscribers a month for the first year, and then 12 million a year, subscribers re-upping every month. We got sustainability. If it's, taking the average price still at $10 a month, you have, 12 million subscribers at $10 a month. You're clearing 9 figures monthly. You've got some operating cash flow, right? But what if they don't get to that? What if there is, instead of saying, I'm not signing up for the Zone, I can see it on my computer. I see it an hour later. Is the timeliness of it? Do they leave people signing in to see Golden Boy fights and then not show them? Does that still go on? They got to get some of that stuff fixed if they're going to really count on people subscribing and staying, right? And so that's the part of it is are people going to stay out and then still see the fights? They'll just get put on the internet at some point to go in, catch it gets taken off, and catch the rest of it later somewhere else. But there's no doubt in my mind that, if there was a way to, if there's a way to cheat, it's going to be found, right? That's the no doubt in my mind. And also, for guys like the Zone, they really do need a level playing field. They need a fair chance and a fair shake for their business model to try out. They may not get it if that's the case. If what I'm talking about is, the potential there, where most people are going to say, it's cool what they're doing, and I'm happy that they're around, and I'm happy that they're paying Canelo and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, that paying stuff, that's for the birds. I'm not doing that. You know what I mean? So, a lot going into the boxing history and boxing's spot in technology. Yeah, this book here, it's got a picture of ladies sitting in the booths of a theater, one of them ignoring the fights and the other one enthralled by it, but both of them dressed in the petticoats and stuff like that. So I'm going to ship pictures here to Aaron. Wrap it up a little bit. Again, give props to Dan Strebel and Fight Pictures. It's a book worth reading. It goes into the history of film and the early history of boxing in a way that really hasn't been looked at by many other authors and stuff like that. Really, really eye-opening stuff. And again, we're at a crossroads in boxing right now with the technology and stuff, as we have been many times in the past with this sport. And people are jumping on people, but what you see is the same. I think you see the same thing. People rolling the dice, people hoping, you know, the competition. A guy here, he's got film equipment, but there's another guy that he went to school with that kind of has film equipment with a little bit of a different spin, that he's trying to get the copyright to do it his way, and he's testing and he's reaching out to fighters and he's offering more for the simulations than you know, crazy. But that type of stuff went on from the very beginning, so why wouldn't it be going on now? I'm Miguel Iturrate for the CRP.